real sanctions across the board on Russian oil. You know, they've hit the insurance companies, they've hit.
And I'm also going to ask Saudi Arabia and OPEC to bring down the cost of oil. You got to bring it down. If the price came down, the Russia-Ukraine war would end immediately. Right now, the price is high enough that war will continue. You got to bring down the oil price. You got to end that war.
Norway has dealt Russia a catastrophic blow of around $75 billion in losses in just 2 years. But what is behind the scenes of this devastating impact? How did Norway's oil and gas breakthrough, rising from the cold waters of the north, come to destroy the energy throne that Russia had enjoyed for so many years? February 2022 marked a turning point in the world geopolitical arena. The West stood by Ukraine with military and humanitarian support and showed President Vladimir Putin a red card through sanctions.
We're banning all imports of Russian oil and gas and energy.
Real sanctions across the board on Russian oil. You know, they've hit the insurance companies, they've hit.
However, these Western moves triggered domestic political unrest. Russia, for its part, has been hit by economic blows, losing valuable trading partners. The 21st century's most critical war has deeply affected the world. But can there be a winner in this war? One side of the scales has to be up while the other side is down. In other words, President Vladimir Putin's decision to go to war is of great benefit to his neighbour Norway. The Scandinavian country is one of Europe's most important oil and gas reserves. The Barents Sea, which Norway shares with the Russian Federation, hides real oil and gas treasures. According to estimates, it contains 2/3 of the country's remaining oil and gas reserves. Norway, the seemingly peaceful country of Scandinavia, with its small population and high level of prosperity, has simultaneously become one of the oil and gas giants of the north and a key player in a new energy order. So how did this quiet revolution come about? In wartime, 2022, 93 fields were in operation on the Norwegian shelf. 70 of them were in the North Sea, 21 in the Norwegian Sea, and 2 in the Barents Sea. Oil and gas accounted for 73% of the total value of Norwegian commodity exports in 2022. Norway became Europe's largest supplier of natural gas in 2022, replacing Russian flows that were cut off after the invasion of Ukraine. It now contributes about 1/3 of the continent's gas. Natural gas sales from Norway totaled 124 billion standard cubic meters last year. This was more than the previous record of 122.8 billion standard cubic meters set in 2022. Total oil and gas production was the highest since 2009. Norway's oil and gas revenues tripled, earning 140 billion United States dollars in 1 year. Most of this money goes to the Norwegian government, which owns a 67% stake in Equinor, the country's energy giant. So Norway is printing money thanks to oil and gas. So how does this affect Russia's economy? As we all know, the Russian economy is based on oil and gas revenues. For many years, much of Europe has been dependent on natural gas imports from Russia to maintain important parts of its energy infrastructure. This was a tremendous boon for the Russian treasury. But all good things must come to an end, and Norway has dealt an effective blow to the Russian economy. In this video, we will explore how Norway crushed Russia's economy as it grew rich on its energy resources. Before we dive into the details of our video, we would appreciate it if you would like to give us a thumbs up and support us. Before 2022, Russia sold its fossil fuels primarily to Europe. Russia was an ideal export market because it could build a network of pipelines connecting it directly to its customers. Some pipelines were inherited from the Soviet era, but in the 21st century, the network was expanded to include Western Europe. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines were crucial for this, as they connected Russia directly to Germany. Germany was an important customer, as it is by far the largest energy consumer in Europe. It was used for electricity generation, heavy industry, and home heating. But Germany is now looking for new suppliers from Norway, the United States, and the Middle East. France, which relies on nuclear power, does not need Russian gas as much, but still supports sanctions against Moscow. Italy, another major market for Russian gas, is trying to reduce its dependence by looking for alternatives in North Africa. Russian oil supplies to European Union countries have also been embargoed as part of the sixth package of sanctions against the Kremlin, which came into force at the beginning of June 2022. Member states have also set themselves the goal of finally ending their dependence on Russian gas within the next decade. In 2023, Russian oil and gas exports reached $30 billion United States dollars, 3 times less than in 2022. In 2024, the value of Russian energy exports to European Union countries was even lower. Moreover, according to official data, the Kremlin's revenue from the sale of fossil raw materials fell by 24%. President Putin cannot replace European Union oil and gas customers in such a short period of time. So Russia's energy market power is disappearing. Norway has dealt Russia a catastrophic blow of about $75 billion in losses in just 2 years. Most of Russia's oil and gas companies are state-controlled, especially the giants Gazprom and Rosneft. But Norwegian oil and gas giant Equinor has quietly taken over the crown that once belonged to Russia's Gazprom. Norway now supplies 30% of the bloc's gas. Before the war, Gazprom supplied around 35% of all European gas. And of the more than 109 billion cubic meters of natural gas Norway exported to Europe last year, about 2/3 was marketed and sold by Equinor. As long as the bloc remains heavily dependent on fossil fuels, Norwegian hydrocarbons will be vital to keep the lights on in Europe. Norway has the world's 22nd largest oil reserves and the 17th largest natural gas reserves. The gap in the European market for these strategically important supplies is being filled by Norway, which has become the largest supplier of the blue fuel since Russia's aggression in Ukraine, supplying almost half of the European Union's demand for the resource. According to data from the Continental Shelf Office, Norway set a monthly gas production record of 379 million cubic meters per day in December 2023. In terms of black gold, deliveries from Norway to European countries at the end of last year amounted to 1.85 million barrels per day. From a financial point of view, the figures were quite impressive. Oil prices exceeded 100 United States dollars per barrel, a historically high level, more than double the 2020 price. Oil continued to be at a fairly high price level for the next 2 years as it remained above 80 United States dollars per barrel for 2023 and 2024. Benchmark European gas prices peaked at €170 per megawatt hour in 2022. This translates into about 200 United States dollars for every megawatt hour. Before the crisis, prices were around 10 or 20 euros, so energy prices increased more than tenfold at the peak. Afterwards, prices fell in Europe as the price per megawatt hour went up to the 20 to 40 euro range. Nevertheless, this is still quite high as it is double what it used to be. The country is now the largest oil supplier to Germany, Europe's largest energy consumer. It used to be only the 4th largest supplier for the European Union. Overall, Norway is now the 2nd largest oil supplier, closely following the United States with $57 billion against $52 billion. The country has become the European Union's largest supplier of natural gas due to Russia's declining market share. In other words, the Nordic state was saving Europe while standing in the way of the Russian Empire. But questions are now being raised as to why Norway has allocated only a little more than 3.1 billion United States dollars to support Ukraine in its 2025 budget. Combined with its 2024 contribution, Norway's support for Ukraine amounts to less than 5% of 2 years of war revenues. By comparison, Germany, Europe's largest single donor, provided Ukraine with $16.3 billion in military, financial, and humanitarian support from January 2022 to October 2024. The United States contributed $92 billion. But while Norway's 2-year income is larger than the United States and Germany's combined, Norway's support to Ukraine as a share of GDP ranks only 9th in Europe at 0.7%. It lags far behind Denmark and Estonia. Norway not only has the capacity to make a much greater difference to the outcome of the war and the civilian reconstruction that followed. It has a clear moral obligation to do so. Given that its surplus revenues are a direct result of Russia's war, surely more of them should go to those who fought and died on the front lines to keep their country free. Instead, the Norwegian government has decided to become a war profiteer, greedily clinging to its lucky gains. The opposition parties, to their credit, proposed higher levels of support for Ukraine, eventually increasing the amount the government had originally proposed. But no party came close to proposing that the total war profits be transferred to Ukraine. The Norwegian government's position is surprising, given that Norway shares a border with Russia and has long relied on the support of its allies for its defence. Its own national security will be jeopardised if Russia wins the war or is militarily emboldened by a peace agreement skewed in its favour. Norway is also unlikely to suffer misery by transferring its windfall from the war to Ukraine. This windfall represents about 6% of its sovereign wealth fund, the largest in the world, with assets worth $1.7 trillion. That is right. Norway directs all government revenue from oil and gas production to the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and a maximum of 3% of the fund's value can be withdrawn each year and transferred to the government budget. This rule helps to limit the effects on inflation and the exchange rate, and ensures that the fund exists indefinitely. But, as a macroeconomic and national savings tool, the withdrawal rule was not designed with wartime demands in mind. It should therefore not be seen as a barrier to a larger transfer to Ukraine. Since such a transfer would not enter the Norwegian economy, there would be no domestic inflationary or other macroeconomic effects. This is not the first time that Norway's accumulation of war profits has been a problem. However, it is the first time we have been given an official estimate of the value of these earnings. The Finance Ministry has given a figure for natural gas export revenues above what would have been generated if gas prices had remained at their 5-year average before the invasion. While such counterfactuals are always subject to uncertainty and debate, the official estimate is the closest to a value for Norway's earnings from the war. In fact, the actual figure is probably much higher. This is because the estimate does not include the excess revenues resulting from higher oil prices after the invasion. While Europeans worry about the effects of Donald Trump's return to power, the Norwegian government and parliament should channel windfall revenue in the form of military and financial support to Ukraine. Yet Norway's support for Ukraine is undeniable. So far, the Oslo government has sent the Ukrainian army 8 Leopard 2A4 tanks, 2 NASAMS missile defence systems, 1,000 Black Hornet small reconnaissance aircraft, Dingo armoured vehicles with Cortex Typhon counter-UAS systems, 100 Mistral air defence missiles, 4,000 anti-tank guns, helmets, bulletproof vests, other protective equipment, 22 M109 155mm tracked self-propelled howitzers. In October, Norway increased its support for the energy sector to 3 billion Norwegian kroner, or about 274.2 million United States dollars, until winter as part of its long-term support plan for Ukraine. Norway is currently providing financing to secure electricity supplies for about 1.5 million people and industrial activities in Ukraine. The Oslo government is making sure that at least 1.5 million Ukrainians will not be cold and will be warmer this winter. Norway is also contributing to the reconstruction of power plants in the Dnipro region, Odessa, Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, and Lviv. The latest procurement through the United Nations Development Programme will make it possible to deliver equipment to the Dnipro region this winter, thus providing an additional 80 megawatts of capacity to the national power grid. The equipment costs will be covered by the fund announced by Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre in June. The funds to be distributed will be used for energy-related projects as well as other types of support to help Ukrainians through the winter. This will cover everything from providing electricity to entire cities to providing individuals with packages containing ceiling strips for windows to better insulate homes from the cold during power outages. Such measures will enable Ukrainians to continue living in their homes instead of fleeing. Recognizing that there are no winners in war, The Oslo government is at least trying to give Ukraine a stronger hand against Russia with humanitarian aid. But of course, such aid cannot bring Kiev a decisive victory. The soldiers on the front line need more tanks, more armoured vehicles, more artillery shells, and missiles. This is where Norway comes in again and aims to pull President Putin out completely. Norway plans to significantly increase its support for Ukraine and proposes to increase the Nansen programme from 75 billion Norwegian kroner to 135 billion Norwegian kroner by 2030, a total of $13 billion. The Oslo government has announced that it intends to provide Ukraine with 5 billion Norwegian kroner, or about 477 million United States dollars, in aid this year, and at least 15 billion Norwegian kroner, or about 1.4 billion United States dollars every year until 2030. Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre announced this proposal after a meeting with parliamentary leaders in Storting. The Nansen programme covers both military and civilian support to Ukraine. In total, Norway has already allocated around 6.4 billion euros to the long-term Nansen support programme for Ukraine between 2023 and 2027. Considering all phases of the programme, Norway's support to Ukraine is likely to continue for the duration of the agreement, but this is not enough for Norway to keep President Putin away from the Nordic region and ensure his defeat in Ukraine. The Oslo government must think so too, as government officials have announced a new programme to boost national defence industrial production, including supplies to Ukraine, with an investment of 967 million Norwegian kroner, or 89.9 million United States dollars. The first phase is aimed at supporting small and medium-sized Norwegian companies supplying advanced technology to Ukraine. The programme will continue to work with local companies and institutions on a new rocket engine production line, the development of hexamine production for explosives, and a feasibility study for a new explosives production facility. Norwegian Defence Minister Bjørn Arild Gram said that this new measure is part of the Norwegian government's Nansen support programme for Ukraine, with a total budget of 75 billion kroner, or 6.8 billion United States dollars, between 2023 and 2027. With such moves, the Oslo government seeks to bypass the Moscow regime and neutralise President Putin both in Ukraine and at the Baltic-Scandinavian crossroads. How do the other Baltic states deal with Russia? In terms of energy security, until 2014, the Baltics were an isolated energy island, without access to European electricity and gas grids, and over-dependent on Russian energy imports. They were subject to Russian political blackmail and interference in domestic politics. The game changer was Lithuania's decision to build a liquefied natural gas terminal on the Baltic coast. Despite active pressure from Russia, Lithuania successfully implemented the project and, at the same time, carried out sweeping reforms to liberalise the gas market and expelled Russia's Gazprom from the Lithuanian energy sector. Similar, but less principled measures were taken in Latvia and Estonia. Although a highly unusual project at a time when most European countries are still comfortable developing and even deepening their energy partnerships with Russia, the Lithuanian LNG terminal has brought with it a full spectrum of positive effects, from short-term gas price reductions to a long-term ability to serve regional and broader European energy security interests. The geo-economic shift of the Baltic states in terms of energy supplies was remarkable. Lithuania, followed by Latvia and Estonia, which met all their natural gas needs with imports from Russia in 2013, became the first European country to ban all Russian gas imports, including liquefied natural gas in April 2022 in response to the invasion of Ukraine. Other European countries, despite Russia's brutal war against Ukraine, remain avid consumers of Russian gas and even increased their import volumes of Russian liquefied natural gas by 11% year-on-year in the first half of 2024. The fully functional liquefied natural gas infrastructure at Lithuania's Klaipėda port and well-established partnerships with liquefied natural gas suppliers, mostly from the United States and Norway, have ensured Lithuania's and the wider Baltic region's principled energy policy and smooth transition from Russia to other gas suppliers. Having become one of the top European importers of United States liquefied natural gas in 2017, Lithuania's liquefied natural gas imports from the United States peaked in 2022, making the United States the leading LNG supplier for Lithuania and sending a clear signal that increased transatlantic cooperation is the right response to Russian aggression and destabilization attempts. In the first 6 months of 2024, Lithuania's liquefied natural gas imports were almost evenly split between the United States and Norway as the two main suppliers. In addition to the Lithuanian liquefied natural gas terminal, symbolically named Independence, infrastructure improvements have also been made in the Baltic states, further strengthening the region's leading role in European energy security efforts. The recent completion of the Latvia-Lithuania interconnection project has given Lithuania better access to the Inčukalns underground gas storage in Latvia. This site is unique in the region and serves as an important gas backup facility. The Baltic countries fill the storage during the summer months, when gas prices are low, to avoid gas shortages during the winter months, when both gas consumption and prices increase significantly. At the same time, the bidirectional ELLI pipeline allows to increase gas flows from the Lithuanian liquefied natural gas terminal to Latvia and Estonia. The importance of the gas interconnector Poland-Lithuania, operational since May 2022, cannot be emphasized enough. The bidirectional pipeline serves as a key element of the European north-south gas corridor connecting the Baltic region and Finland to continental Europe. It further diversifies the Baltic countries' gas import routes and opens up new possibilities for using Lithuania's liquefied natural gas terminal as an entry point for liquefied natural gas into the European gas market. A recent agreement between Slovakia and Poland to bring United States-sourced liquefied natural gas through the Klaipėda liquefied natural gas terminal, where Poland's oil and gas company Orlen provides long-term capacity, and later through GIPL and the Warszawa link between Poland and Slovakia from January 2025, signals the changing geo-economic realities in the region. Instead of using the traditional east-west link originating from Russia and passing through Ukraine, Slovakia will use this new route to source natural gas from the north for the first time. This is an important step for the country because the traditional gas supply route originating from Russia and transiting through Ukraine is on its last legs as the gas transit contract between Russia and Ukraine expires on January 1, 2025. Beyond the elimination of their dependence on Russian gas, the Baltic states are also preparing to eliminate their remaining ties with Russia in the electricity sector. The Baltic states are currently dependent on Russia at the electricity system level, but in February 2025, they will disconnect their grids from the BRELL electricity ring, which provides unified conditions for grid operation in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, and Russia under the Centralized Integrated Electricity System/Unified Electricity System distribution controlled by Russia. After a decade of preparation, the Baltic countries will finally synchronize their electricity grids with the continental European network. To achieve this goal, multiple power interconnectors with Finland, Sweden, and Poland have been established onshore and offshore, allowing the Baltic countries to stop trading electricity with Russia and Belarus. It is clear that the transatlantic commitment to common political, economic, and security goals must adapt to a new security environment, while proactively pursuing its strategically important geo-economic agenda, if the Baltic energy security bulwark is to withstand pressure from Russia and expand to strengthen the north-south energy corridor in Europe. Since his inauguration, the world's attention has mostly focused on President Donald Trump's love affair with tariffs.
I think tariffs are the most beautiful word. I think they're beautiful. It's going to make us rich.
Tariffs is the most beautiful word to me in the dictionary.
But the new administration has said relatively little about its intentions regarding the use of sanctions. There is one exception here. Donald Trump announced that he would impose further sanctions on Russia if it refused to end its ridiculous sanctions. Following this announcement, Mr. Trump announced the oil price at which Russia will lose billions of dollars.
And I'm also going to ask Saudi Arabia and OPEC to bring down the cost of oil. You got to bring it down. If the price came down, the Russia-Ukraine war would end immediately. Right now, the price is high enough that that war will continue. You got to bring down the oil price. You got to end that war.
In this video, we will analyse the latest US blow to the Russian oil network and explore the impact of this move on Russia. President Donald Trump has said that targeting Russia's oil revenues is the best way to end Moscow's war against Ukraine. During the campaign, Trump promised a swift end to tensions and leaned on the idea that OPEC+, the alliance of oil-producing countries, was the key to ending the war by lowering oil prices. On Friday, the president reiterated his call for the group of oil-producing exporters, led by Saudi Arabia, to lower the price of oil. Trump said it was a move that would cause Russia to lose much-needed revenue to fund the conflict and force Vladimir Putin to reconsider the war. Trump made similar calls to OPEC+ during a virtual speech at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland this week, the annual gathering of world leaders and corporate elites. OPEC is made up of 12 oil-rich countries, including Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, which collectively account for around 40% of global oil supply. Their enormous weight as a bloc means that they can significantly influence the price of oil by increasing or decreasing production. Keith Kellogg, the United States President's special envoy for Ukraine and Russia, said that an OPEC+ oil price cut to $45 per barrel could push Russia to end the war. This is because the current price of black gold is about $78 a barrel. According to Kellogg, a price of $45 per barrel is the basic equilibrium point. More drastic measures to impact the Russian oil sector could force the Kremlin to negotiate an end to Russian aggression against Ukraine. The special envoy stated that the international community cannot force Russia to end the war against the Ukrainian state by helping Ukraine win on the front line. In the absence of a reaction from Saudi Arabia, Trump's statement had an immediate impact by lowering oil prices. Texas oil fell 1% to $75 a barrel. In December 2024, Saudi Arabia, Russia, and 6 other OPEC+ members extended measures to reduce production on the world market by 2.2 million barrels per day to prevent prices from falling too much. This measure is expected to last until March 2025 and then be phased out within a year. However, according to industry experts, the pressure on OPEC+ is an uphill battle. Last month, the alliance postponed raising oil output as it faced weaker than expected demand and competitive production from non-allied countries. Iran is both an OPEC member and an ally of Russia and could oppose Trump's proposed plan. Relations between Saudi Arabia and Russia are complex, but the countries have cooperated on oil. In 2016, Russia and other oil producers not part of the alliance joined with Saudi Arabia and other members of the oil cartel to form OPEC+. Russia and Saudi Arabia are the largest producers in the enlarged alliance. This move was made in response to a significant drop in oil prices, largely due to United States shale oil production. The United States is not a member of OPEC or OPEC+. Patrick DeHaan, head of oil analysis at GasBuddy, said Trump has a better relationship with Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman than his predecessor, Democrat Joe Biden. Hahn said the Saudis still have bills to pay and Trump is making a big demand. Oil companies respond to economics, not self-interest. So how is the Russian side responding to the tough United States measures? The Kremlin rejects the idea that the United States and its allies could force Russia into talks to end the war by targeting the oil sector. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that the conflict does not depend on oil prices. The conflict continues because of the threat to Russia's national security, the threat to Russians living on these territories, and the refusal of the Americans and Europeans to listen to Russia's security concerns. It is not linked to oil prices. The United States and its allies have imposed a price cap on Russian oil at $60 per barrel, But Moscow has been able to maintain a steady revenue stream from sales, relying on buyers such as China and India, who benefit from Russian discounted prices. According to the International Energy Agency, global oil supply is currently running about 700,000 barrels per day ahead of demand. This surplus is already affecting the price. On the other hand, the outgoing administration of Joe Biden offered the Trump presidency a perfect carrot-and-stick combination on Russian oil sanctions. In the last days of the Biden administration, the United States imposed the toughest restrictions on Russia's oil sector since 2022, when the Kremlin launched an all-out offensive against Ukraine. The United States blacklisted 2 major oil producers, 2 major insurance companies, and numerous smaller companies trading in Russian oil. But the most significant step was the ban on 183 oil tankers belonging to the so-called shadow fleet. The 2 oil producers, Surgutneftgaz and Gazpromneft, are large companies but account for only about half of Russia's total oil and refined product exports of about 7 million barrels per day. It would be relatively easy for Russia to circumvent sanctions against these 2. They could modify their export contracts with clean firms or set up a new company solely for the export of crude oil and related products. Sanctions against insurers could be more costly, as Russia's customers may start avoiding all Russian insurance companies for fear of further sanctions. This would entail demanding higher insurance premiums and wider discounts on Russian oil. But the most damaging element could be sanctions on tankers. The cumulative capacity of blacklisted vessels is close to 1/3 of total exports of Russian crude oil and related products. The initial reaction from India and China, Russia's biggest customers, was a promise not to serve these ships in their ports after the exemption expires in February. Consumers are scouring markets for alternatives to Russian crude, which is trading at a widening discount. What will happen next? The credibility of the new sanctions regime is largely in the hands of the Donald Trump administration. For sanctions to work, the United States must convince Indian and Chinese buyers that it will not hesitate to apply secondary measures against smugglers. All United States measures are designed to involve complete isolation from the dollar market and, in most cases, from Western financial and banking systems. Unless secondary sanctions prove to be real and imminent, buyers will be inclined to ignore or circumvent the restrictions. True, there are ways around United States sanctions, as the trade in Iranian and Venezuelan oil shows. Ship-to-ship transfer, where oil is transported between 2 ships at sea, cargo unloading and reloading, where sanctioned crude is unloaded on land and mixed with clean oil for further sale. To pressure Russia, President Trump would have to convince President Putin that he was ready to hit hard. The current sanctions give him the means to target these devious practices and Russia's major customers in India and China. If the price of oil doesn't rise too high for too long, something that any United States administration would find difficult to tolerate, the new measures offer a plan to expand the network and capture more ships and traders. Most likely, Russia will still be able to sell some crude oil, but at a lower price and with higher costs, thus cutting off important revenues that help finance the war machine. On the other hand, a lenient application of secondary sanctions could be used as an important carrot if the United States is looking for the Kremlin's goodwill. Donald Trump could take a surprising turn to secure United States dominance in global oil and gas markets while weakening Russia, a major competitor in both natural gas and oil. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine nearly 3 years ago, Europe has reduced its dependence on Russian energy imports in favour of United States supply. This is especially true in terms of United States liquefied natural gas, with more than half of United States exports now going to Europe. However, Europe faces the risk of switching back to Russian energy without additional United States action. This makes making further efforts to limit Russian natural gas in Europe an important strategy to strengthen a key engine of United States economic growth. While United States LNG export capacity will double by 2028, world LNG markets will potentially be oversupplied as early as 2026. Accordingly, numerous policy and regulatory tools need to be used to maintain United States competitiveness in the sector. In addition to lifting the Biden administration's pause on the authorization of United States LNG export infrastructure, the Trump administration should maintain and strengthen sanctions on Russian energy, expand United States global oil exports, and increase United States gas shipments to Europe. If these actions are taken, they will weaken Russia's already fragile position, strengthen United States' influence in future negotiations, stabilize prices, and potentially bring about a positive end to the war in Ukraine. The United States and Russia compete in energy markets, especially natural gas, and Europe is the primary battleground. With Europe rejecting Russian energy following the country's invasion of Ukraine and Europe's rejection of Russian energy, United States LNG exports to Europe increased by more than 3,700% from 2017 to nearly 7.4 billion cubic feet per day in 2023. United States LNG shipments to Europe are likely to increase further with the recent cessation of Russian gas transit through Ukraine, and will increase further if the European Union realizes its goal to completely phase out Russian LNG by 2027. Europe remains the primary market for United States LNG, while Asian demand is growing. High costs due to long distances and Panama Canal fees limit the competitiveness of Gulf Coast LNG in Asia compared to Qatari and Australian producers. In contrast, United States shipments to Europe travel shorter distances than cargoes destined for Asia and avoid paying Panama Canal transit fees. Also, unlike shipments from Qatar and Australia, United States cargoes do not face possible narrow passages in the Red Sea. This is reflected in Houthi efforts to block transit through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. Importantly, a significant return of Russian gas to Europe would severely damage United States LNG exporters and Trump's America First agenda. Forecasts suggest that there could be a global LNG surplus later this decade if all planned projects are completed. Moreover, the resumption of significant Russian gas flows to Europe would put pressure on United States LNG exporters, although this seems unlikely at the moment. While some LNG exporters are protected by take-or-pay contracts, others rely heavily on spot markets and could be severely affected if Russia reclaims market share at its own expense. But the United States-Russia rivalry does not end in natural gas markets. The United States and Russia are also rivals in the oil markets. United States crude oil exports have grown from 700,000 barrels per day in January 2017 to 4 million today. Since February 2022, United States crude exports to Europe have increased by 800,000 barrels per day, helping to replace Russian production cut as a result of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. With United States liquid fuel consumption falling through 2026 and domestic gasoline demand already peaking, United States oil and gas exporters will increasingly rely on foreign markets and intensify competition with Russian producers. Russia is not sitting idle in the competition. Moscow is considering merging its three major oil companies to create a giant producer. Strengthening sanctions on Russian oil and gas now will not only benefit United States companies, it would also give Trump more bargaining power vis-à-vis Russian President Vladimir Putin. The Russian war machine is rapidly running out of money. The Russian state is pursuing a two-pronged strategy to cover rising war costs, supplementing its tightly scrutinized defense budget spending with funds from a similarly sized but largely ignored off-budget financing scheme. This off-budget financing stream is authorized under a new law that quietly went into effect on February 25, 2022, authorizing the state to force Russian banks to grant concessional loans to war-related businesses on terms set by the state. Since mid-2022, Russia has experienced an abnormal 71% expansion in corporate debt worth $415 billion, or 19.4% of GDP. This incremental corporate credit growth is large relative to key budget benchmarks. It significantly exceeds both total oil and gas revenues and defense budget spending over the same period, and is 6.5 times larger than incremental government borrowing. Analysis of sectoral lending data shows that more than 70% of corporate credit growth went to sectors engaged in war-related activities. Not all credit to these sectors was used to finance goods and services for the war. However, based on the analysis in this report, it is estimated that between 50 and 60% of wartime corporate credit growth was used to finance war-related businesses under the government's off-budget financing scheme. These are loans that the state forced banks to extend on concessional terms to largely uncreditworthy war-related businesses. On this scale, Russia's off-budget financing flows are roughly equal to the total expenditures flowing through the federal defense budget. Between 2010 and 2022, the Kremlin used a similar off-budget financing scheme, albeit on a smaller scale. The explicit purpose of this scheme was to secretly fund its costly rearmament program, while publicly appearing to maintain budget discipline. The current scheme achieves a similar goal of creating a misleading impression of the resilience of Russia's war financing capacity by allowing official budget spending to remain at sustainable levels. In short, Russia's total war costs are much higher than official budget spending suggests. By forcing banks to lend on off-market terms to businesses providing goods and services for the war effort, the state is secretly financing about half of these costs through substantial off-budget borrowing. Unlike the defense budget, which has been kept at sustainable levels, Russia's off-budget defense financing scheme has become much more problematic to sustain in the second half of 2024. It has grown so large that it is driving up inflation, raising interest rates for real economic borrowers well above 21%, and creating the preconditions for a systemic credit crisis. In the second half of 2024, the Bank of Russia began to identify the state's concessional corporate credit scheme as a significant threat to Russia's economic stability. As the main contributor to monetary expansion, it is fueling Russia's rising inflation. Worse, because this lending is strategic rather than commercial in nature, the CBR observes that it is largely insensitive to interest rate increases, blunting the main tool the CBR uses to fight inflation. As a result, the CBR says it has had to tighten much more aggressively to cool overall borrowing than would otherwise have been needed. High borrowing costs are causing financial distress among healthy companies in the real economy, prompting the CBR to raise concerns about the risk of excessive borrowing by large corporations. These at-risk companies are likely to include Gazprom, which has borrowed heavily on domestic markets by 22% or more to cover losses from the collapse of its core business of exports to Europe. The CBR also expressed concern about the situation of large banks, which have been operating under greatly eased regulatory policies since sanctions were increased in early 2022. According to the CBR, some banks have taken advantage of the eased policy to lend aggressively without providing sufficient short-term liquidity and adequate capital buffers. It is now clear that Moscow's heavy reliance on off-budget bank financing to finance the war has created the preconditions for a systemic credit crisis. By raising interest rates, it is creating financial distress among companies in the real economy. And by saddling significant amounts of debt to war-related companies that are likely to default over time, it risks overwhelming banks with a wave of toxic debt. Unsurprisingly, since late October, the CBR has been publicly calling on the government to restrict the preferential financing scheme. But this would undermine the state's ability to maintain current levels of war financing without a major increase in official defense budget spending. The US should therefore seize this moment to ensure that long-term US LNG exports to Europe permanently replace Russian natural gas flows. Indeed, Trump could help the US achieve energy dominance by strengthening sanctions on the Russian energy sector, reducing Russian export revenues, deepening Europe's energy ties with the US, and, importantly, creating more leverage over Moscow in future negotiations over Ukraine. As leaders, including Trump, have often noted, peace is achieved through strength. Securing a favourable deal with Russia requires the effective use of US power. Russia's nearly 3 years of failure in Ukraine has seriously undermined its own geopolitical and economic power. Back at the beginning of the war, Moscow believed that it could use the flow of natural gas and oil as leverage to pressure Europe. In this way, Moscow believed that it would not only face less backlash on the international stage, but also achieve its ambitions over Ukraine much faster. However, things turned out differently, especially from the winter of 2022 onwards. Europe rapidly reduced its energy shipments from Russia by signing up new suppliers and, surprisingly, managed to manage this sharp turnaround. Europe managed to fight back and find new suppliers. This weakened the idea that Europe's hands were completely tied. Despite this, Russian gas continued to flow to Europe in smaller quantities, which surprised many given that the war had already started. Equally surprising was the fact that Russian gas continued to flow through Ukrainian territory. Despite airstrikes, battlefield skirmishes, and deep animosities, these pipelines remained operational as a result of a pre-existing agreement between Kiev and Moscow. But the phrase, "all good things must come to an end," has once again come true. Ukraine dealt Russia a major blow by shutting down the Russian gas pipeline on the last day of 2024. But how could Ukraine's move affect Russia and Europe? Why did Ukraine wait so long to make this decision? For the answers to our questions and more, our video begins. Although Ukraine's move may seem symbolic, it is actually a decision that could have huge consequences for Russia, Europe, and other regional actors. The impact on Europe may be very limited, as most European Union countries have already drastically reduced their dependence on Russian natural gas. But from Russia's point of view, at a time when its budgetary income from energy has already collapsed due to the war, this loss could precipitate a complete collapse. There was also talk that certain countries, such as Slovakia and Austria, might face difficulties in the short term, but it seems that all of them have taken precautions by finding new sources of supply. Nevertheless, cutting off Russian gas through Ukraine creates an even bigger dilemma for the Kremlin's already fragile budget than it had anticipated. In the early stages of the war, Russia sent a message to the international community, and especially to Europe. "You need my gas." This message was largely based on the past, as energy dependence had been in place for decades, and key European countries such as Germany, France, and Italy were highly dependent on Russian hydrocarbons. In fact, in 2021, 41% of the European Union's natural gas needs were supplied by Russia. Likewise, Russian crude oil accounted for a third of the EU's total oil imports. Therefore, the Kremlin hoped that Europe would turn a blind eye to Russia's invasion, or at least remain silent in order not to be left out in the cold. But when the war began in February 2022, European governments began to consider new supply alternatives, even though they knew they would be forced to do so. Liquefied natural gas imports from the US, Qatar, Norway, Algeria, Australia, and even some Latin American countries were increased. At the same time, energy corridors within the EU were strengthened, storage facilities were filled, and austerity measures were implemented. As a result, dependence on Russian gas fell sharply in the winter of 2022 to 2023, and there were no freeze crises or major industrial disruptions. The political will in this process largely neutralized Russia's energy blackmail strategy. But despite this picture, Russian gas was still partially flowing through Ukraine until the end of 2024. This is because the Kiev government did not abruptly terminate the contract in order not to catch Europe off guard. Ukraine also acted cautiously in order to maintain its image as a state that respects international law, abides by agreements, and does not weaponize energy. When the transit agreement with Russia expired at midnight on December 31, 2024, the Ukrainian state announced that it would not renew it, and so the last major gateway for Russian gas to Europe was closed. For Brussels, this closure is a manageable problem, as Europe has reduced its share of Russian gas from 41% to 8% in the last 2 years. For Gazprom, however, the blow is a big one, as the Nord Stream pipelines have been sabotaged. The Yamal Europe and Belarus corridors have been closed due to political crises, leaving only the Turk Stream line and some small interconnections. Last year, Gazprom reported its first operating loss since 1999 and is now set to lose another 5 to 6 billion euros. This will further reduce the company's tax contributions to the Russian budget. Russia has found new customers in Asia, but mostly for oil. Significant parts of its gas infrastructure are now dormant, and the redirection of gas export markets to Asia is too slow and too costly to manage while waging war against Ukraine. By rapidly moving away from Russian gas, the EU has shown a surprising ability to muster the political will and agility needed to see results, finding new suppliers, especially liquefied natural gas in the US and Norway. The EU has also increased its energy resilience. Prices have fallen well below their inflation peak in 2022, and gas storage tanks across Europe are now more than 90% full. There is therefore no doubt that Brussels will be able to manage the fallout from the end of gas supplies from Ukraine. This is made easier by the fact that until recently, only 3 countries were dependent on Russian supplies. Austria stopped buying gas in November due to a contract dispute with Gazprom, but it had plans in place to minimise any disruption, which were quickly and effectively implemented. Hungary receives its supplies primarily through the Turkstream pipeline, which allows it to cover its deficits. It can also buy more liquefied natural gas from Croatia, where the EU is building a major new terminal to process imports primarily from the US. Energy risks are also low for Slovakia. The country is well integrated into the EU energy grid and has ready alternatives for electricity and gas supply. In any case, of the approximately 12 billion cubic meters of Russian gas the country receives annually, only a third is for its own domestic consumption. The rest was sold at a profit within the EU. Robert Fico, the country's Russia-friendly Prime Minister, has tried hard to renew the transit agreement. This included unsubstantiated claims of an energy crisis in Europe, threats to punish Ukraine for terminating the transit agreement, and a visit to Moscow in December. This visit was a rarity for an EU head of government, but their efforts have proved futile over time. With the end of gas transit through Ukraine, the days when Putin could easily weaponize energy supplies against EU members are over. But the end of Russian gas transit through Ukraine is not without victims. Moldova has been badly hit. In government-controlled areas of the country, a 60-day energy emergency imposed in December imposed significant restrictions on domestic consumption. The Moldovan government seems confident that the country can survive the winter, but its preparedness for the crisis that has clearly been brewing since Ukraine announced in the summer of 2023 that it would not renew its transit contract with Russia was weak, leading to the dismissal of the energy minister and the head of the main state energy company in November. This does not bode well for the pro-European government, which faces parliamentary elections in late 2025. The government is still recovering from a deeply polarised referendum on future EU membership and presidential elections in October 2024, both marred by massive Russian vote buying and disinformation campaigns. Perhaps an even more significant problem is the much more precarious situation in the breakaway region of Transnistria. Some 300,000 people there were completely dependent on Russian gas delivered via Ukraine. As of January 1, they have no heating or hot water. The region's main power plant has switched from gas to coal, but coal supplies only last for about 50 days. Apart from the minimum domestic needs of the population, Transnistria's economic model was entirely based on the availability of essentially free Russian gas. When this is no longer available, there is a risk that an economic and humanitarian crisis could quickly spiral out of control. This poses major political and security risks for Moldova. Already grappling with its own energy crisis and economic problems, Moldova has little flexibility to provide aid to Transnistria or to deal with large numbers of refugees. While this could create a favourable moment to force the question of reunification, for Moldova it would be an extremely risky gamble. Transnistria is still home to Russian forces. They were deployed there as peacekeepers after a brief violent conflict in the early 1990s and guard an old Soviet ammunition storage facility. Its population has also been swayed by Russian and separatist propaganda for more than 3 decades, hardly strengthening the pro-European vote. None of this means that Moldova faces a violent upheaval or that Russia could somehow manipulate the situation to open a second front behind Ukraine. In the long run, with its last major leverage in the energy war against Europe now gone, Russia stands to lose the most from the end of gas transit through Ukraine. In fact, if Ukraine had taken this decision earlier, Russia would have lost more quickly. But there were reasons why Ukraine did not cut off the flow sooner. First, parts of Europe still relied on that gas supply, and a sudden shutdown could have led to a humanitarian crisis in nations that had not yet fully switched to other sources. Second, Ukraine wanted to preserve its reputation as an international player that honoured agreements even under difficult circumstances. This was contrasting itself with what it saw as Russia's pattern of aggression. Now, however, this contract is over. Ukraine chose not to renew it, probably calculating that the negative consequences for certain European regions would outweigh the strategic benefit of putting more pressure on Russia. What has happened in practical terms is that a number of places in Europe continued to depend on Russian gas until this decision, and these places are now in real trouble. In addition to gas, Russia's oil empire in Europe is collapsing. Russia's problem is not only with gas but also with oil. Until the summer of 2022, Europe was the biggest buyer of Russian crude oil. In fact, tankers were transferring an average of 1.5 to 2 million barrels of oil per month to ports such as Rotterdam and Trieste. However, the EU's embargo and price ceiling imposed on Russian oil imports by sea in December 2022 almost ended this trade. An embargo was also imposed on refined petroleum products in 2023. Thus, the European market in oil, Russia's most profitable export item, disappeared. Russia is looking for compensation in Asia, but even there, big buyers like China and India are buying Russian oil at significant discounts. As a result, Russia is forced to sell at much lower prices despite selling less. Between sanctions, freight costs, insurance, and supply chain constraints, the return on Russian oil is falling rapidly. Industry experts predict that energy revenues, which account for more than half of the Russian budget, will fall by more than $100 billion between 2023 and 2025. Nord Stream expansion has been discussed in the past, with the addition of an oil-only pipeline alongside Nord Stream 1. Both NS1 and NS2 have suffered serious ruptures, with sections destroyed by mysterious explosions and confirmed to be beyond immediate repair. This eliminated 500,000 barrels a day from Russia's export capacity. Russian crude oil was also delivered at full capacity to European ports via tankers, delivering an average of 1.5 to 2 million BPD to hubs such as Rotterdam and Trieste. The aim was, in the spirit of cooperation, to complement the old pipeline network and provide a significant portion of Russian oil through sea deliveries to European countries without direct pipeline access. This was before the EU imposed a ban on seaborne imports of Russian crude oil on December 5, 2022, followed by an embargo on refined oil products in early 2023. Given that pre-invasion seaborne export levels were 1.5 to 2 million BPD, current volumes have been reduced by at least 90%. There was also the ambitious Transalpine pipeline, designed to transport crude oil from the port of Trieste in Italy to Central Europe, serving countries such as Austria, Germany, and the Czech Republic. Driven by the Russian Federation's desire to pump at least 1 million BPD to these countries, this was part of a broader strategy to secure impact. Fortunately, the pipeline was never completed due to environmental concerns and growing geopolitical opposition. Both the Transalpine pipeline and the Burgas-Didiagach pipeline were vital for transporting Russian crude oil to Europe. Although not a direct delivery route, the Burgas-Didiagach pipeline transported Russian oil by tanker once it reached Trieste. Sanctions imposed in response to the attack on Ukraine, coupled with a wider divergence from Russian energy supplies, rendered these pipelines obsolete. Their subsequent closure displaced 1 million BPD, which was replaced by alternatives from the Middle East, North America, and other regions. Many refineries in southern and central Europe switched to other sources as Russian oil became politically unpalatable. By the end of 2023, the EU's imports of Russian fossil fuels had been cut by 94%, from $16 billion per month to around $1 billion per month. What is left? The Druzhba pipeline, one of the largest in the world, has a maximum capacity of about 1.2 million barrels of crude oil per day. Its two main branches distribute oil to different regions. The North Branch delivers around 700,000 BPD to Belarus and the western regions of Russia, while the South Branch delivers around 500,000 BPD to Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. The announcements and legal initiatives aimed at stopping this flow of oil, yet the pipeline continues to operate under its current contract, is seen by many as an indication of political hypocrisy. But there is more to this situation than meets the eye. Poland stopped importing Russian oil through the Druzhba pipeline in early 2023, and Ukraine refused to accept the same oil and only temporarily agreed to let it pass through its territory. As a result, the Druzhba pipeline is currently delivering only 42% of its maximum capacity. Strictly speaking, the Druzhba pipeline remains the only channel for exporting Russian crude oil to Europe, supplying oil only to Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic. In November 2024, the Czech Ministry of Industry and Trade confirmed that the country will not seek an extension of its exemption from the EU ban on Russian oil imports. This signals a planned shift away from Russian oil supplies, reducing deliveries by around 150,000 BPD and reducing the overall volume by 29%. Now, some of you may be wondering why the EU cannot impose a blanket ban on Russian oil. You might ask why Hungary, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic were granted exemptions from the EU ban on Russian oil imports. These countries are landlocked with limited alternative supply options, lack the necessary infrastructure to quickly switch to other oil sources, making the Druzhba pipeline a vital lifeline. It has long been Europe's Achilles heel, the lever that Russia believes can never be broken. In terms of pain and political gain, maintaining Russian oil imports helps stabilize energy prices and ensures security of supply. It offers short-term economic benefits before Europe secures more alternatives and moves away from hydrocarbons altogether. There has been visible progress as most European countries have diversified their sources of oil imports, reducing dependence on Russian pipelines. For example, the railway line connecting mainland Russia to Kaliningrad via Lithuania remains operational through January 2025. However, the primary commodities transported via this route are goods such as cement and other materials, not oil. The reality is that no one will increase imports of Russia's hydrocarbons without a legally binding compensation scheme for the coming decades. This leaves Russia heavily dependent on Turkey for its oil consumption. Russia's crude oil reaches Turkey primarily by tanker and is transported from Black Sea ports such as Novorossiysk, Tuapse and Taman to Turkish ports such as KRFEZ and Alia A. Since oil spills have already occurred on these routes, it is clear that this situation cannot continue indefinitely. Why would Turkey want oil to wash up on its shores? But it still is, because in 2023, Turkey was one of the biggest importers of cheap Russian oil, especially diesel fuel. By the first half of 2024, Turkey had significantly increased its imports of discounted Russian oil, and crude imports by sea had risen to 70% from 34% in 2023. However, with growing environmental and logistical concerns, the question is, how sustainable is this in the long term? This is particularly important given Turkey's plans to expand oil exploration in the Black Sea and Mediterranean regions, where offshore reserves show potential. Turkey paid between $20 to $3.30 per barrel less for Russian diesel in 2023 compared to similar grades from other sources, saving around $2 billion over the course of the year. Turkey, together with India, refines imported Russian crude oil and exports refined products, benefiting from the price differential. these neutral countries continue to secure discounted rates, maintaining the flexibility to diversify their energy imports. The downside for Russia is that it is losing potential revenue from its crude oil, a trend that is expected to continue in the coming years, making extraction economically unsustainable. As global markets become saturated and countries like Brazil, Guyana, and Canada increase their exports, Russia may be forced to sell oil to China at a steep discount. Building a new pipeline to China, fully financed by China, would likely require even bigger discounts, putting Russia at an even greater disadvantage. If global oil prices remain low, especially with the rise of alternative fuels and next-generation nuclear, maintaining Russia's oil rigs can no longer be justified in an oversaturated market. All these economic woes directly affect Russia's war budget. Gazprom, which already announced a loss in 2022 for the first time since 1999, has now announced that it will lose another 5 to 6 billion euros with the closure of the Ukrainian transit pipeline. Similar losses will be experienced on the oil side. This makes it difficult for Moscow to finance its already astronomical defense spending. In his 2025 budget, Russian President Vladimir Putin allocated $145 billion for defense, the highest figure of the post-Soviet era. At 6.3% of GDP, this is more than double the pre-war defense spending of $66 billion. But if energy revenues continue to fall at this rate, Putin will either have to print money, seek foreign loans, or deepen the economic crisis by taxing the population more to sustain this massive defense budget. All options mean more hardship for the Russian people. This could lead to a further decline in public support for the war, which is already waning. These developments paint a very dark picture for the Putin administration's economic continuity as well as its war strategy. Unless there is a fundamental change in the course of the war or a radical retreat by Moscow, it is highly likely that the Russian economy will continue to bleed through 2025. Therefore, at a time when the energy trump card is becoming increasingly irrelevant, Putin's grand calculations are turning into a big fiasco in reality.
Donald Trump will be sworn into office as the 47th President of the United States.
So we all know that Donald Trump has said he's obsessed with tariffs, but
US President Donald Trump shook the world agenda as soon as he took office. Before he came to power, Trump was already promising radical changes, but no one expected this much.
There are growing fears of a major global trade war tonight.
Donald Trump's first order of business was to impose a 25% tariff on Canada and Mexico. This move has already caused major question marks in the global economy. Then, Trump drew his second sword and claimed that Europe was a thorn in the side of the United States. Therefore, Donald Trump signalled that the decision to impose tariffs on the EU, just like Canada and Mexico, would be taken.
We have a $350 billion deficit with the European Union. They treat us very, very badly, so they're going to be in for tariffs.
While this second shock sent global markets reeling, the US leaders' moves were not limited to this. This time, Trump targeted the BRICS group, which also includes Russia.
And if the BRICS nations want to do that, that's okay, but we're going to put at least a 100% tariff on the business they do with the United States.
So what was Donald Trump's plan against BRICS? What decisions did Trump take to corner Russian President Vladimir Putin and break BRICS' allegiance to the United States? How did the BRICS members react to Donald Trump's decisions? We will explore all these questions together and take an in-depth look at how US President Donald Trump is reshaping global economic dynamics and how this strategy is affecting countries and markets around the world. But before we do, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and give us a like to stay up to date with our content. Let's get started. First, let's take a look at US President Donald Trump's critical remarks targeting BRICS.
US President Donald Trump has warned of BRICS member countries from replacing the US dollar as a reserve currency.
Donald Trump shook the agenda by reiterating his threat of 100% tariffs if BRICS member countries replace the US dollar as their reserve currency. The BRICS group includes Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, with several countries joining in the last few years. It is quite remarkable that Donald Trump is suddenly confronting all these countries with the threat of tariffs. The grouping does not have a common currency, but the long-running debate on the issue gained some momentum after the West imposed sanctions on Russia over the war in Ukraine. According to Trump, BRICS has no chance of replacing the US dollar in international trade or anywhere else, and any country that tries or would try such innovation should say hello to tariffs. With this threat, the US leader wants to show that he is obliged to protect his country's currency and that he is against the economic restructuring of the BRICS group. The dollar's major role in the world economy, dollar dominance, has recently been strengthened by a robust US economy, tighter monetary policy, and rising geopolitical risks. Economic fragmentation has even increased the tendency of BRICS countries to switch from the dollar to other currencies, and Trump intends to eliminate this trend altogether. A study conducted last year by the Atlantic Council's Center for Geoeconomics showed that the US dollar remains the world's primary reserve currency, and that neither the euro nor the BRICS have been able to reduce global dependence on the dollar. Trump is keen to preserve this picture, but the US leader's harsh rhetoric against the BRICS has normally provoked a backlash from the group. So how did the BRICS members respond to Donald Trump's threat of a 100% tax hike? At the plenary session of the 15th BRICS summit in 2023, Russian President Vladimir Putin stressed the need to eliminate dollarization.
В частности, укрепляется пятистороннее сотрудничество по таким направлениям, как диверсификация цепочек поставок,
calling on BRICS countries to increase payments in national currencies and strengthen cooperation between their banks. These efforts gained momentum after the United States expelled Russia from the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, or SWIFT, a major player in international financial transactions. Similarly, Iran was removed from SWIFT in 2012, a move widely seen as contributing to Tehran's decision to negotiate in 2015. In response to Trump's threats of a 100% tax rate, Russian officials have now said that any US attempt to force countries around the world to use the dollar will backfire. Iran is likewise expected to support the Russian authorities against this tax threat. In contrast, India, a central member of BRICS, has repeatedly voiced its opposition to such de-dollarization efforts. The Indian Ministry of External Affairs reiterated in December that India is not in favour of de-dollarization and that there are no current plans to create a BRICS currency. Such divergent reactions from BRICS members raise the question of whether US leader Donald Trump's tax threats will work. The BRICS bloc remains the only major international organisation in which the US does not participate. Despite Trump's threats, BRICS members are likely to continue exploring alternatives to the US dollar as part of their broader economic strategy. But do the BRICS have the capacity to withstand these economic tariffs if US leader Donald Trump's threats become a reality? To answer this question, it is necessary to consider what BRICS is all about. Originally excluding South Africa, the acronym BRIC was coined in 2001 by Goldman Sachs chief economist Jim O'Neill in a research paper highlighting the growth potential of Brazil, Russia, India, and China. The bloc was established as an informal club in 2009 to provide a platform for its members to challenge a world order dominated by the US and its Western allies. South Africa was the first country to benefit from the bloc's expansion in 2010.
The first ever BRICS summit is getting underway in Russia,
when the group became known as BRICS. The group added Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates in 2023, with Indonesia becoming a member earlier this month. With all these countries joining the group, the total economic network of BRICS has a very strong spiral structure. After BRICS has amassed so many actors over time, the US has stepped up its game and launched targeted activities against the grouping. The aim was to prove that BRICS was not capable of harming the US. Following the announcement of the BRICS expansion in 2023, former US National Security Advisor John Bolton appeared in the press to address concerns about the threat the bloc poses to Western interests. Bolton described BRICS as a diverse but incompatible collection of countries and suggested that BRICS is a heterogeneous entity, a very mixed bag whose members do not naturally come together and whose expansion poses no serious threat. However, Reinhard Bütikofer, an EU diplomat from Germany, expressed a different perspective, arguing that the recent expansion of BRICS threatens Western dominance. According to Bütikofer, BRICS is becoming increasingly confrontational towards the West, and many developing countries may turn to the bloc if Europe fails to prove its credibility and reputation as a fair partner. These different perspectives on the implications of BRICS's expansion presented an intriguing topic to explore, as they highlighted the complex dynamics of members' strategic interests and their influence within the bloc. China was most distracted by US leader Donald Trump's imposition of a 100% tariff to explore this internal structure of the BRICS and to further separate the grouping from each other. As the largest economy in BRICS, China helps shape the bloc's agenda and priorities. In this context, it becomes even more important to explore China's strategic interests within BRICS. China's evolving role, especially in terms of its economic and geopolitical goals and challenges, pointed to the need to consider BRICS in the broader context of its efforts to tackle global challenges. This was probably Donald Trump's thinking as well. After coming to power, Trump primarily wanted to beat China in the global economic competition. Therefore, he tried to force BRICS, which includes China, with tariffs. However, the debate about US leader Donald Trump's imposition of tariffs against BRICS expansion ignores a critical question. How do China's strategic interests shape the bloc's agenda and decision-making processes? And what are the implications of this influence for global governance and economic cooperation? And does the Beijing regime really want to launch a tariff war against Trump for a different currency against the dollar? Amid changing global economic and political dynamics, understanding China's strategic interests and influence within BRICS is critical to grasping its ambitions. As the bloc's largest economy, China has made efforts to deepen cooperation with other emerging economies and strengthen BRICS's collective interests on the global stage. Beyond advocating for expanded membership, China has utilized BRICS as a platform to counter Western dominance. Recognizing the value of improving global governance through greater participation, other countries such as Brazil, Russia, and South Africa, but not India, which initially disagreed on the BRICS expansion agenda, have shown interest in expanding cooperation with other emerging economies. China's active support for the recent BRICS expansion demonstrates its strategic interests and influence in the bloc. This expansion gives China leverage to leverage the bloc's strengths to its advantage and navigate the complexities of a multipolar world. China's BRICS plans are to use the alliance to increase its global influence through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative, but other members have different priorities. Russia, for example, is currently grappling with Western sanctions and sees BRICS as a way to offset them by diversifying its economic partnerships. Its economic leverage is limited compared to China's. Brazil and South Africa focus more on regional development and often try to use BRICS to achieve more significant global influence. However, their global interests are more regionally focused and less ambitious than China's. Beyond its advocacy for enlargement, China's influence is seen in its significant contributions to key projects such as the NDB and the Contingent Reserve Arrangement. China played an important role in establishing the NDB, a financial institution that finances infrastructure and sustainable development initiatives in BRICS countries and other emerging markets. China's significant financial contribution to the NDB highlights its changing role in multilateral development banks and its interest in promoting economic expansion and monetary balance within the coalition. For BRICS-Africa relations, China has already established itself as a major investor in African infrastructure and resources, and its growing influence within BRICS could lead to further coordinated efforts to deepen economic ties between the Belt and Road Initiative and African countries. However, China's growing interest and influence within BRICS is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, its economic and geopolitical power could bring more significant infrastructure and trade connectivity to the bloc, mainly through initiatives such as the Belt and Road Initiative. This could be a game changer for member states, spurring economic growth and cooperation. On the other hand, China's growing dominance could increase tensions with other members, especially India, which is wary of the Beijing regime's expanding influence. India's concerns are valid, given that the two countries have a complex history and competing interests in the region. BRICS is a multinational bloc with diverse domestic and geopolitical interests. This has led to geopolitical rivalry among member countries, affecting their collective efforts and ability to shape a new world order. For instance, power struggles between China and India, economic downturn and political instability among the bloc's members can significantly hamper their ability to navigate complex geopolitical landscapes. Long-standing border conflicts and territorial disputes, such as the Doklam impasse and recent clashes in the Galwan Valley, have strained bilateral relations between China and India. These developments have led to a prevailing atmosphere of suspicion between these two key bloc members. China and India harbour historical resentments and antagonistic territorial disputes, hampering efforts to promote trust and improve bilateral relations. Both countries see their border regions as strategically important and seek to assert their influence, leading to competition for control and influence. The ongoing geopolitical tensions between China and India could escalate further, mainly due to significant political disputes between new players such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Iran. While China has strong ties with Iran, India maintains close relations with Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Any shift in these alliances could increase friction. For example, India has been cautious about the Belt and Road Initiative, seeing it as an economic initiative and a way to increase China's geopolitical influence. India is particularly sensitive to projects involving neighbouring countries such as Pakistan, which plays an important role in this initiative. This could intensify existing tensions between India and China, as India may see the growing economic influence of the Belt and Road Initiative as a way for China to overshadow its position on the global stage. Involving Saudi Arabia and Iran could increase tensions due to their long-standing regional rivalries. Different parties' interests and conflicting alliances could affect cohesion and decision-making. The growing divide, especially regarding regional security dynamics and maritime disputes in the Persian Gulf, adds complexity to BRICS' relations and could affect the group's stability and progress. In addition, this could have consequences for global trade routes and energy flows, as disruptions in the Persian Gulf region could affect the energy security and market stability of BRICS economies. The likelihood of resolving these tensions within BRICS seems minimal. Recently, however, BRICS members have sought to show that they are moving closer together to resolve these issues. In the context of the newly expanded BRICS, the 2024 summit in Russia marked a critical moment in shaping the future of global governance and economic cooperation. With inflation, debt crises, and uneven post-pandemic recovery at the forefront, the bloc was increasingly exploring alternative trade mechanisms, global economic restructuring, and even a common currency to reduce dependence on the West. China, as the largest of the BRICS economies, was mainly focused on consolidating the bloc's leadership, strengthening economic ties with key regions, and promoting its vision of a multipolar world. So with so much disagreement within BRICS, US leader Donald Trump may see this as an opportunity. In particular, Donald Trump may have sensed China's strengthening of its leadership position within BRICS and may want to indirectly mobilize the Beijing regime. However, these possible plans of the US leader could be dangerous. Despite Trump's threats, experts believe that China will continue to encourage the use of its national yuan in international transactions. China's yuan has become more acceptable to foreign countries, but the authorities still strictly control the flow of funds under the capital account. China is no longer seeking a global yuan as state-owned companies and Chinese individuals move money abroad. In 2013, the Belt and Road Initiative was organized to drive the US dollar out of the Chinese economy and limit the need for market interventions. However, Chinese state-owned companies launched a speculative offensive that forced the hand of the People's Bank of China. The Chinese authorities supported capital markets and restricted households trying to move capital abroad. Meanwhile, the US has increasingly strengthened the global dollar, and the growing threat of US sanctions has limited Chinese policymakers' options. Central to the yuan's future are the crucial questions of whether China will seek to de-dollarize the global economy or simply hedge against possible US sanctions. For the next few years, China seems doomed to the second question. De-dollarization will require China to maintain free capital markets. But the lessons of 2015 suggest that this could lead to another financial crisis in China. Still, China seems willing to continue to denominate central bank agreements for cross-border trade deals in renminbi to counter the sanctioning power of the US dollar. Given these details, China is unlikely to respond adequately to US leader Donald Trump's plan to impose a 100% tariff against the possible emergence of a new BRICS currency. However, China's stance may change when combined with Russia and other partners. Therefore, it remains to be seen whether Donald Trump's tariff threats against BRICS members will work. Thank you for watching. Norway is a country in the northwest of Europe, famous for its vast fjords and mountain landscapes, with a very high per capita income. But behind its glacier-covered landscapes and generous welfare state, the country has recently found itself in an unexpected security equation. As the war in Ukraine drags on, Russia's growing geopolitical ambitions are threatening Norway's borders. As a member of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, Norway has attracted a lot of attention from the Kremlin due to its strategic location in the Arctic and its critical role in oil and gas exports. Until recently, Moscow and Oslo enjoyed a balanced relationship. However, Russia's full-scale attack on Ukraine and the rising threat perception across Europe forced Norway to take swift and drastic steps. Today, Norway has adopted a policy bold enough to tell Russia enough is enough. This sharp turnaround was not just a declaration on paper. The Oslo government announced billions of dollars in aid packages to Ukraine and sent a message of determination to the whole world by supporting both its own defense capacity and Ukraine's combat power in the military arena. In this video, we look at how Norway is supporting Ukraine on the battlefield and resisting Russian tyranny. Norway has been one of the staunchest supporters of Ukraine in Europe. Earlier, Norwegian Prime Minister Jonas Gahr Støre announced on December 16th that Norway would provide 2.7 billion Norwegian kroner to strengthen Ukraine's navy and deter Russian threats in the Black Sea. In 2025, a new support package was announced. On January 9th, Ukrainian Defence Minister Rustem Umerov met with Norwegian Defence Minister Bjørn Arild Gram during the Ramstein summit in Germany. The two ministers discussed the prioritisation of Norwegian assistance. The talks paid special attention to strengthening air defence. Umerov said that the aid to Ukraine in 2025 will be the largest military aid package in Norway's history. Arild announced that Norway has allocated €2 billion for military support to Ukraine for 2025. In addition to military support, Norway intends to continue investing in Ukraine's defence industry and joint projects, including the production of ammunition. Norway's unwavering support for Ukraine since the early days of the war has been widely echoed in the Kremlin corridors. The Oslo government's latest support is likely to anger Vladimir Putin. From the very first days, Putin has strongly opposed NATO member states providing military support to Ukraine. The Russian leader also tried to intimidate other allies, Norway in particular, by implying that these aid packages would escalate the war. Although Putin's words have not translated into actions, Russian aggression is growing every day. In this context, Norway is taking various measures to protect its country. The Norwegian government has announced plans to reintroduce the obligation to build shelters in new buildings, which has been suspended since 1998. The decision comes as Moscow's full-scale war against Ukraine approaches its third anniversary, and Russia, which borders Norway in the Arctic Circle, shows no sign of backing down from its aggressive behaviour. Norwegian Minister of Justice and Public Safety, Emily Enger Mehl, said that there is more uncertainty around us. We must take care of the civilian population in the worst-case scenario of war or armed attack. Until 1998, every large apartment complex in Norway was required to have a bomb shelter. However, no new bomb shelters have been built since then, Mail said that this requirement would apply to complexes over 1,000 square metres. The government is proposing two types of shelters. New shelters to protect against chemical and radioactive weapons and conventional weapons that could be taken from subway stations or parking lots and used for other purposes. The measure is part of a total preparedness report that includes hundreds of different proposals aimed at strengthening and preparing Norway for a possible war, as well as for extreme weather or pandemics. At the same time, Norwegian public opinion is undergoing a major shift. Whereas previously there was an advocacy of a soft neighbourly policy with Russia, the atrocities in Ukraine and the attacks on civilians have reduced this tolerance to almost zero. A significant part of the population now thinks, let's not sleepwalk into danger. We must stop Russia. The parties in Parliament have followed suit, giving the green light to increase defence spending beyond NATO standards. Norway has also played a central role in the collective defence of Northern Europe, playing a key supporting role in the NATO accession processes of Finland and Sweden. The Russian leadership is not happy that Norway is making big strides despite its small country image. Although official rhetoric often says that Norway wants to continue living in peace with Russia, the Kremlin's leadership in Oslo is too closely intertwined with Washington and is acting in partnership with the US in the background of European defence. At the diplomatic level, Russia is increasing the dose of insinuations such as refrain from provocations, otherwise you will suffer the consequences. However, this threatening tone did not have the expected effect on Norway. The country has become even tougher, constantly repeating the message that we will not tolerate any action that jeopardizes our security and sovereignty. In this tense atmosphere, Norwegian authorities are also focusing on long-term projects. In particular, the security of the North Sea and Barents Sea regions is a priority for both the country's economic security and Europe's energy supply. The massive disruption of Russian energy supplies to Europe has allowed Norway to fill the continent's natural gas and oil gap. This has brought billions of dollars of additional income to the Norwegian economy and reduced Russia's energy weapon power. Norway has thus become a strategic saviour for Europe. Nevertheless, the Oslo government knows that this strategic supplier status could be met with jealousy or hostile actions by the Russians. It is therefore planning major investments in cyber defence, pipeline security and maritime traffic control. These measures by Norway raise some questions. Could Norway be Russia's next invasion plan? North of the Norwegian mainland is Norway's Svalbard archipelago, which is currently under direct but little-known threat from the Russian government. Svalbard is an internationally demilitarized zone north of the cold Arctic, rich in coal mining, metal ore, phosphates, oil and natural gas. There are no soldiers on these islands, and most of these resources are protected from extraction by huge nature reserves and a few increasingly hungry polar bears. In theory, it is a very peaceful place, unless you are an Arctic seal. But not everyone is happy to see billions of dollars of economic value locked away in nature reserves. And if someone, impressed by the lack of military presence, decides to come in and adjust the international order, things could change here at any moment. The incentive to do so would be the same incentive that has caused this sort of thing to happen literally thousands of times throughout human history. Unlocking the archipelago's strategic position as a gateway to the Arctic Ocean, as well as the multi-billion-dollar value of its natural resources, is an area where geopolitical tensions are rapidly escalating. Changing the status of Svalbard is becoming an issue that Russia is becoming increasingly interested in. Currently, the Svalbard archipelago is controlled by the Norwegians and is under Norwegian sovereignty, but Russia has legal settlements here and a small permanent population of about 400 people. These Russians are here, strangely enough, to operate an unprofitable coal mine. There are much more profitable resources that these miners could easily focus on within the borders of mainland Russia. So it seems strange that they are so focused here. So, until they realise that this coal mine is widely seen as an attempt by Russia to stake a claim to the Svalbard region, it gives them an incentive to keep the mine in use despite losing money hand over fist. So they will have a foothold in case at some future date they want to revisit the geopolitics of this region to seize more of Svalbard's resources. Some military analysts think that future date could be very soon. In fact, we see many signs that these thoughts may be correct. Since 2022, Russia has increasingly used this small population to threaten Norwegian territory. Norway has responded by imposing sanctions on Russian goods entering its territory. Russia took advantage of this situation to produce a crisis in Svalbard that significantly increased tensions between the two countries. Shortly after the sanctions came into force, the Russians began sending trucks with packages of food and supplies destined for settlements in Svalbard towards the Norwegian mainland border, even though the supplies could easily be shipped directly from the Russian port of Murmansk to circumvent the sanctions and avoid potential problems. Then, when denied entry into Norway, the Russians were taken by surprise and walked out, even though the Norwegian sanctions were very clearly communicated in advance and impossible to misinterpret. Russian officials took immediate action, pointing to the situation of Russian coal miners in Svalbard and claiming that Norwegian authorities were deliberately trying to prevent them from receiving food supplies in order to starve them to death. Russian leaders in Moscow called it a humanitarian emergency, and the situation was used in the Russian media as an example of why they decided to invade Ukraine because of NATO brutality. Of course, the situation was not as Russia claimed. Russia had to spend a few $1,000s more on transportation costs. Russian officials in Svalbard admitted that there was plenty of food and supplies in the settlements, and that there was no immediate crisis. But behind these statements, the Russians had hidden plans. In taking these steps, Russian officials planted tested and proven propaganda talking points about Svalbard in the Russian consciousness, similar to the talking points that allowed Russia to invade Georgia and Ukraine with strong domestic support. This laid the groundwork for potential fodder to be used by the Russian propaganda machine that can be resurfaced and exaggerated at any time should Russia want to invade the Svalbard region and possibly even mainland Norway in the future. Norway, for its part, saw Russia's verbal attacks as an attempt to portray Norway as a violator of the Svalbard agreements. In response, some analysts are concerned that the Russian military could take advantage of the demilitarized status of the Svalbard archipelago to invade it without a fight. The gamble in this eventuality would be that Norway and its NATO allies would choose not to respond, accepting Russia's demands rather than risk a potential nuclear war over a series of cold and very sparsely populated islands in the far north. If Russia seizes these islands, it will give them the ability to make further gains in the Arctic, or make it easier for them to attack mainland Norway in the future. So why is Russia so focused on Norway in particular? Norway and Russia are locked in a high-stakes duel of wealth building in the northernmost regions of the world. A duel for oil and gas profits. This duel between Russia and Norway is a duel that Russia categorically loses. In the case of Norway, it is one of the richest countries in the world in terms of annual real GDP per capita, giving a staggering figure of over USD 80,000 per capita. While for the United States itself, this number is only around USD 67,000. By comparison, Russia sits around $27,000, making the average Russian 3 times poorer than the average Norwegian when comparing GDP per capita. In reality, things are even worse than that for the average Russian, due to inequalities in the distribution of wealth. So for Russia, the best and easiest way to improve living standards, and perhaps more importantly for the people calling the shots, the best and easiest way for Russian oligarchs to build more wealth, is to take a larger international share of industries they already know how to run. This is potentially bad news for Norway, because they too are right next door to Russia and in direct competition with them for the energy resources of the far north. It is a high-stakes game with potentially trillions of dollars of untapped value. Both oil and natural gas are available in large quantities off the northern coast of the Eurasian continent. Norway and Russia have a complete monopoly of these resources beyond the North Sea. This shared area is thought to be one of the largest untapped oil and gas resources on the entire planet, and much of it is located in the Barents Sea, a sea shared and famously disputed between both Russia and Norway. But Norway's presence there, perhaps more importantly, not only provides Russia with economic competition, but also puts a hard limit on the extent to which Russia can threaten Europe with energy blackmail. A clear example of this was the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. At the time, Russia thought that by cutting off Europe's supply of Russian energy, it could take Europe out of the picture. But Norway was there, ready and able to fill the gap and ensure that European nations could weather the crisis. During this time, Norway greatly increased its energy exports, making them even richer than they already were, experiencing the most profitable years in its history, while Europe stood strong with all the energy it needed and stepped up its support for Ukraine. This was done with oil and gas extracted in the Barents Sea, right across Norway's maritime border with Russian waters, in an area recently claimed by Russia, but given to Norway in the 2010 border agreement. Russia naturally began to regret the old maritime agreements as soon as they no longer suited them. But Russia is unlikely to get out of this situation. The border between Russia and Norway is small and easy to defend. Even if Russia managed to cross it, it would not be of much strategic value, as the part of Norway bordering Russia is connected to the rest of the country by a single road running back and forth across mountainous terrain. In sum, Norway seems too far away to be the next destination of Russian aggression. Norway has a protective shield, both in terms of the measures it has taken and its geographical conditions. As for what Russia will do, after its costly and devastating experience in Kiev, it is a mystery whether it will embark on an adventure towards the North Pole. Norway's logic, however, is that the low probability of this happening is no reason to be unprepared. After all, the unpredictable is always the biggest factor in security policy, and no one wants to wake up one morning to an unwanted guest in Arctic waters. In light of all this, tensions between Norway and Russia are unlikely to ease in the short term. The picture is further complicated by the course of the Ukraine war, the accelerating energy competition in the Arctic, and the rebalancing of NATO's northern flank with Finland and possibly Sweden. Norway continues to identify Ukraine's struggle with its own, while at the same time developing a reflex to be prepared for any attack on its territory or maritime jurisdiction. If Russia threatens our borders, if it wants to destabilize Europe, then we have to say no to this aggression, Oslo insists, adding that our assistance for Ukraine will continue until this war is over. Thank you for following us. The Year of the Snake looks set to live up to its ominous reputation. For Russians, snakes are the symbol of upheaval in the Chinese zodiac. The revolutions of 1905 and 1917, the Nazi invasion of 1941, the death of Stalin in 1953, and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989 were all overshadowed by it. Now, the Russians fear that history is once again twisting to strike. 3 years have passed in the war in Ukraine. Millions of soldiers have lost their lives at Vladimir Putin's insistence, while ordinary citizens have found refuge in emigration. For the Russians who remained in their homeland, the days have been a nightmare. As the war moved to Russian soil, the economic hardship of the war took its toll on Russians. In this video, we look at the state of the Russian economy. As Donald Trump's term begins, the Kremlin is beginning to taste the poison. Trump said that, "We have figures that almost 1 million Russian soldiers have been killed. They have more soldiers to lose, but that is not the way to run a country. I think Putin is destroying Russia."
I don't know if Putin does. He might not. I don't know. He should make a deal. I think he's destroying Russia. Soldiers are being killed on a daily basis at numbers that we haven't seen in decades.
The war in Ukraine would have never happened if I were president.
I think Russia's going to be in big trouble. You take a look at their economy, you take a look at the inflation in Russia.
The numbers prove that Mr. Trump is not wrong. The scales of the Russian economy are tipping towards disaster, controlling only 20% of Ukraine, with perhaps 1 million casualties, defeats at sea and in the air, dependence on North Korea and meagre territorial gains. Russia is losing resources. The Kharkiv buffer zone remains a distant dream. Missile strikes have failed to paralyze Ukraine's resolve, and the cost of the war weighs heavily. 6% of the federal budget goes to care for the wounded and compensate the families of the dead. Inflation is languishing at 9%, interest rates are at 23%, and prices of essentials like bread and butter are rising sharply. History tells us that when Russia's economy suffers, internal turmoil is usually not far behind. 2 days ago came Trump's clearest signal yet. The president said that, "I do not want to hurt Russia. I love the Russian people, and I have always had a very good relationship with President Putin." However, after these words, it was reported that he would do a huge favor to Russia and President Putin, whose economy is failing. Trump said that if there is no deal, he will impose high levels of taxes, tariffs, and sanctions on everything Russia sells to the United States and various other participating countries. The message here is quite clear. Negotiate now, otherwise you will face much more severe economic contractions. This is a significant departure from the Biden administration's cautious stance on sanctioning Russia. Fearing global market disruptions, Biden has continued to resist measures that could seriously threaten Russia's oil and gas profits. He even sought to deter Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil fields that financed the war. But now there are rumors that Trump may even leverage $330 billion in frozen Russian state assets, threatening to give it to Kiev to buy United States weapons. The president's remarks resonated strongly in the Kremlin corridors. Sources close to the Kremlin report that Russian elites are increasingly hopeful that an agreement can be reached in the conflict. The statement from the United States side is allegedly worrying even Vladimir Putin. When the war began, Russia faced more than 13,000 restrictions, making it the most sanctioned country in the world. Russia was kicked out of the SWIFT global banking system, while Western countries froze Russia's access to some of its foreign reserves. Europe also froze purchases of Russian oil and gas. Trump's ultimatum is a serious warning for the Russian economy. Defense and security needs have dominated federal spending every year since the full-scale invasion in 2022. In the 2025 budget, it reached 40% of total spending and represented more than 8% of the country's gross domestic product. Most of this money went to arms production and military salaries. Since the beginning of the war, Russia has doubled its production of armoured vehicles, and some ammunition producers have quintupled production. Russia also began mass-producing the inexpensive Shahid military drones, originally designed in Iran, to protect its relatively expensive missile arsenal. Moscow is devoting significant funds to expanding its military. The army recruits 20,000 to 30,000 soldiers each month and offers hefty enlistment payments to lure men to the front lines. The estimated cost of this recruitment effort is between $16 and $25 billion a year. This figure does not include the additional costs of providing aid to wounded soldiers and compensating the families of the dead, because official statistics are classified. The Kremlin spending spree has bolstered the economy, giving the superficial appearance of stabilizing growth and low unemployment. From 2022 to 2024, additional government spending amounted to a fiscal stimulus equivalent to more than 10% of total gross domestic product. Banks made concessional loans worth more than $150 billion, and overall corporate credit increased by almost 20% in 2024. This money was mostly allocated to the construction, agriculture, and retail sectors, and the military-industrial complex. The latter has become the main driver of economic growth. According to official statistics, manufacturing industries, the sector to which the military-industrial complex belongs, grew by 7.6% in the first 9 months of 2024. Wholesale and retail trade, driven by consumer demand, grew by 8%. Unemployment in Russia almost halved between February 2022 and December 2024, falling from 4.1% to 2.3%. But the initial wartime economic expansion is slowing. Between the second and third quarters of 2024, Russia's gross domestic product growth fell from 4.1% to 3.1%. Industries engaged in defense production are still expanding, but at rates far below their peak in 2023. In other words, the Russian economy is starting to hit a wall. Increased war spending is also causing distortions. The government is financing the 2025 military budget by raising taxes on households and companies and transferring almost all of the additional revenue directly to the military. Meanwhile, outside the defence sectors, budgets for social services, national economic programmes, and even domestic security and law enforcement are either stagnating or being cut. Deprioritising the civilian economy will stifle growth and worsen social inequalities. Chronic underfunding in some parts of government will also take a toll. Without sufficient resources or personnel, agencies such as the Interior Ministry and the Federal Penitentiary Service will struggle to fulfil their mandate, leading to increased crime and internal insecurity. It will become increasingly difficult to ignore the structural constraints on Russia's economic growth. Most importantly, the country is running out of production capacity and has a labour shortage. Factories are running at 81% capacity, compared to pre-war levels of less than 60%, and 73% of firms report labour shortages. Unemployment figures fell in December, leaving an estimated 1.6 million jobs vacant. The tight labour market has pushed up wages, especially in industrial areas. In the Kurgan region, home to Russia's sole producer of armoured personnel carriers, wages have risen 33% since 2022. In the Volga and Ural regions, two defence production hubs, wages have risen at almost the same rate. This wage increase has reduced business profitability, and its unequal distribution has exacerbated existing regional inequalities. Domestic demand is rising as a result of aggressive state war spending and increased consumption by households profiting from the rapid growth in both military and civilian wages. But due to limitations in production, the Russian economy is unable to meet this demand and has therefore become more dependent on imports. The increased demand for foreign currency has weakened the ruble, which, combined with rising wages, has led to inflation. This inflation, a direct consequence of the Kremlin's transition to a war economy, is imposing a significant cost on Putin's core supporters. For some households, wages are rising faster than inflation, but the wages and benefits of pensioners and public sector workers, including teachers, doctors, and law enforcement personnel, are tied to the official inflation rate, which was reported at 9% in December. And depending on consumption patterns, many households face a real inflation rate of over 20%. Everything from food and services to cars, housing, and utilities is getting more expensive. These rising costs are creating inequality and beginning to fuel discontent, especially as the Kremlin prioritizes defense spending over social programs, public service infrastructure, and other forms of support that can ease people's economic burden. The Russian government has struggled to control inflation. Although the central bank had previously aimed to reduce inflation to 4% by 2025, it has pushed that target back to mid-2026. A related problem, the ruble exchange rate, which has weakened as rising demand for imports has increased the need for foreign currency, has also proved intractable. The government's tools to stabilise the ruble are limited. In peacetime, more foreign money was flowing into Russia through international funds. The central bank could also intervene in the financial market to smooth out fluctuations in the value of the ruble, but sanctions have frozen half of Russia's foreign exchange reserves, and the central bank is keeping the rest for emergencies. Capital controls introduced in 2023 have restricted the central bank's ability to use monetary policy effectively, and already sky-high interest rates leave little room for further increases. Russia's sovereign wealth fund also has few liquid assets it can use to strengthen the ruble exchange rate. These problems are likely to persist due to sanctions and the resource-driven nature of the Russian economy. Geography limits the volume of Russian exports. Its buyers are primarily in China, India, and a few Asian countries that Russia can only reach by sea. But we also see fluctuations in cooperation between China and Russia. China's largest companies are uncomfortable with the devaluation of the ruble and the weakening of Russia's economy. The weak ruble has also caused tension among exporters in China, which has become Russia's main trading partner after sanctions dried up other markets. The depreciating Russian currency has caused a sharp rise in local commodity prices. Russian consumers' willingness to buy has weakened, thus reducing orders from China. The yuan-to ruble exchange rate rose from 1 yuan to 13.99 rubles on November 22nd to 15.61 on Thursday, and then fell to 14.91 on Friday. It is the volatile exchange rate fluctuations that further erode Chinese traders' profit margins after the settlement. Pavel Bazhanov, a Russian lawyer who provides legal support to Russian businesses in China and the wider region, said Chinese exporters in the e-commerce sector are particularly concerned about the depreciating ruble, as November is a selling month. During this period, marketplaces are pressuring their suppliers to provide discounts. Military analysts do not expect Chinese entrepreneurs to stop all sales or normal trading on Russian e-commerce platforms unless the ruble goes into free fall. First of all, Russian customers still have some purchasing power. Also, Chinese businesses will look all over the world to find consumers for their goods, given that the Chinese economy is not in good shape, and Donald Trump's threat of additional import duties on Chinese products. Chinese businesses therefore need to explore all available foreign markets, and the Russian market could still be an option. Despite this option, the collapse of the Russian economy could trigger Chinese aggression. There are many examples of this in history. When the Russian Empire started to expand eastward, it ended up having border friction with China. The Russian eastward expansion reached the Amur River. China, then ruled by the Manchu Empire, reacted with military force and forced Russia to sign the Treaty of Nerchinsk in 1689. On that day, the Chinese army had superior military power. By signing the treaty, Russia lost access to the Sea of Okhotsk and Far Eastern markets. Russia's influence was pushed back to the western part of Lake Baikal. This treaty would last until 1858. While China was heavily involved in suppressing the Taiping Rebellion, Russian General Nikolai Muraviev took advantage of the situation. Muraviev massed an army in Mongolia and Manchuria. He then demanded territorial concessions from China, and the Qing dynasty relented. The result was the Treaty of Aigan. The Russians gained all of Siberia up to the Amur River, the political border between Russia and China. The Treaty of Aigan is considered one of the unequal treaties. Mao Zedong once questioned the legality of the unequal treaties, while admitting that there was no hope of recovering the lost territories. Conditions are different today, now that China is totally dependent on imported oil and the free use of the world's oceans. Ironically, it is the United States Navy that guarantees peaceful passage on the world's oceans, and in the event of conflict, these ocean trade routes will not be open and free. In the event of conflict, China will need an alternative source of oil, and the territories taken from China by the Treaty of Aigan have abundant reserves of the oil China needs. In the event of a collapse of the Russian economy and government, Russia's ability to maintain its sovereignty in Siberia would be negligible, except for the use of nuclear weapons. On the other hand, as new tankers are sanctioned, Russian companies' ability to transport goods is increasingly constrained, and difficulties in cross-border transactions and the threat of secondary sanctions make it difficult to find new customers. Overall, sanctions increase operational costs for Russian exporters. Foreign exchange earnings are therefore unlikely to increase. Interest rates will remain in double digits for the foreseeable future, with Russia's current account surplus, increased spending and import dependence deepening the ruble's weakness and fueling inflation. Business profit margins are shrinking, and there is little room to turn things around in technology exports. Russia lacks technological innovation with high export potential. This is partly due to nearly 3 years of sanctions and war. Productivity growth is also hampered by sanctions, which prevent the import of technology that could improve labour productivity. Putin can manage the economic consequences of his war in the short term. Businesses can survive a year of double-digit interest rates on loans if they cancel their investments. With $31 billion in the National Wealth Fund, the government should be able to temporarily solve the financial problems of companies it deems too big to fail. But it may only have enough cash on hand to spend once. The authorities could create a larger financial buffer by issuing war bonds that entrepreneurs and households would have to buy. The substantial payments to soldiers and the wider increase in salaries have also improved living standards for many Russians. Increased death benefits are injecting wealth into Russia's poorest regions in exchange for a steady stream of soldiers for the war effort. Military careers were again seen as respectable, partly with the help of the government's Time of Heroes program, which trains serving soldiers for administrative posts when they leave the army. For them, the war in Ukraine offers not only attractive salaries, but also real social mobility. In the words of Russian President Vladimir Putin, a new elite is being created. Embracing a military career now seems to be the fastest way to gain some kind of recognition, whether the soldiers return from the front or not. Russia has developed a well-practiced narrative of soldiers returning from the front as heroes. Schools invite them to give speeches. The memory of fallen soldiers is kept in local offices. Desks are left empty, honoured with biographical details and personal items from a soldier's life. For these poor soldiers who enlisted for money rather than patriotism, the government's actions are pragmatic. This is money that most of the people in these remote areas have never seen in their lives, so it is not surprising that many accept it. For the Kremlin, offering soldiers good salaries is the only way to sustain the war effort with a high level of national support. While the average salary in Russia is about 75,000 rubles, or about 720 euros a month, the government is offering them at least 210,000 rubles, or just over 2,000 euros a month, not counting potential bonuses. For the time being, this quells public discontent and gives the Kremlin some breathing space. But by 2026, it will be impossible to ignore the limits of Russia's economic model. For 2026 and 2027, federal budget projections call for modest cuts in defence spending. But given the high cost of replenishing depleted arsenals and the interests of Russia's military-industrial complex, a more significant reduction is unlikely even if the war in Ukraine ends this year. In the meantime, inflation will cause more pain in Russian society and the costs of a war-driven economy will rise, worsening structural problems and pushing Russia towards a showdown. But until that showdown comes, simmering economic problems are unlikely to overcome the forces that have made Putin determined to continue the war in Ukraine. Popular pressure is unlikely. For many Russians, dignity means state-provided salaries and pensions rather than political or civil liberties. Public sentiment may change as inflation continues to bite, but the idea that Putin's wartime leadership meant economic prosperity and national pride, and that peace would bring decline and humiliation, will be hard to erase from the public consciousness. Putin's ultimate goal remains unchanged. He wants to deny Kiev the ability to chart an independent foreign policy and maintain a strong military. In essence, he wants to strip Ukraine of its sovereignty. None of the ceasefire proposals currently on the table meet his maximalist demands. For Putin, Ukraine is not just a geopolitical flashpoint, but an obsession that dictates his long-term strategy. If he accepts an end to hostilities in the near term, it will likely be part of his plan to regroup, restock, and prepare for renewed aggression. In Putin's current calculation, the spectre of a sovereign, self-sufficient Ukraine poses a far more serious threat to Russia than the more distant prospect of economic disruption. If Western capitals cannot count on the imminent collapse of the Russian economy, they must face the reality that Russia will pose an enormous challenge over the next year or more. The United States and Europe must support Ukraine during this critical period by working together to strengthen sanctions enforcement and find ways to manage possible changes in United States policy or fissures within the European Union. In the end, the cumulative price of Russia's war economy will have to be paid. The West should plan now for this contingency to take advantage of the opportunity when economic collapse becomes an immediate and inevitable reality for Putin. But Ukraine's supporters should not expect this moment to come anytime soon. For now, the question is whether Trump will act pre-emptively or wait to see how his talks with Putin play out? More aggressive support for Ukraine today would strengthen the West's hand at the negotiating table. Waiting risks handing over the strategic initiative to an aggressor. Moreover, it is optimistic to think that negotiations with Moscow will end well. After all, Putin has never abandoned his maximalist goals of trying to bring Ukraine into his orbit and humiliate the West. Snakes teach us that calculated actions are more powerful than reactive attacks. 2025 could be the year when the United States stops taking baby steps and acts with the precision and decisiveness that this moment demands. It could be the year the snake bites back fatally. This is what Moscow fears, and Trump alone can do it. We should all hope that he does. Thank you for choosing